This presentation had its origin in a paper about his site at Lyminge, which Gabor gave a few months ago in Durham. In this, he was, as he has been this morning, interpreting the results of his archaeological research as showing a transition within the excavated areas from a secular function to a religious function. This touched a raw nerve in me, for I have for some time found it very difficult to accept such a distinction between secular sites and religious sites. I consequently attacked Gabor's position, I hope amicably, and it's a great tribute to his generosity and open-mindedness that the upshot of that is my presence here today and this presentation. The secular-religious distinction applied to sites which were centres of government poses, I think, questions at two levels. At one level, is it the case that centres of government, which we might want to call secular, really were distinct either in their features or their functions from religious sites? Or was close integration between secular and religious elements the norm? At a deeper level, what was the nature of rulership as it is reflected in centres of government? How closely was rulership linked with religion, so that the ruler was himself a religious figure, and any distinction between his secular and religious functions would have been plainly absurd? To use Francis Oakley's subtitle from his stimulating 2006 book on kingship, how far was kingship the politics of enchantment? I want in this presentation to draw on work which I've been doing since 2010, funded by a Leverhulme Trust Major Research Fellowship, for my book The Power of Place, which is appearing shortly. This book is founded on the idea that there may be fundamentally similar patterns in the nature of rulership across Europe and across a wide time range. The book settles for the 1st to the 16th century AD, but it could have gone further. And that those patterns may be discernible if we range widely in time and space. I am today going to focus on the nature of centres of government, like Lyminge is presumed to have been, and ask, is it possible to see a broad pattern in the relationship between secular and religious at such sites? And is it even appropriate to use the terms secular and religious to describe them? If you'll bear with me, I want to begin with some of the really heavyweight royal and imperial sites of the High and later Middle Ages. First, the so-called Palazzo dei Normanni, the palace complex in Palermo, Sicily, lavishly developed by the Norman rulers of the Kingdom of Sicily in the earlier 12th century, and especially the spectacular chapel which is at the heart of that palace, the Cappella Palatina. If you stand at the midpoint of the interior of this building and turn towards the east, you appear to be looking into the sanctuary of a standard, if lavishly decorated, Byzantine-type church, with its rounded apse and its great dome over the choir. But if you now turn westwards and look down the nave, a rather different character is apparent in the fitting and decor of the building. Two aspects seem to me significant. First, the platform against the west wall. This has been interpreted, as my label shows, as a throne platform, original to the 12th century structure. And the reasons for it being original are, it seems to be quite convincing, and we can go into them later if you wish. As part of the backing of it, there is a large octagonal piece of porphyry, a rare purple marble, as you know, which especially designated a ruler, both because it was rare and because like the cloaks of the Roman and Byzantine emperors, it was purple. The lions, which are part of the original mosaic decoration, were probably intended to allude to the lions around the throne of the biblical king Solomon, and were often used as attributes of a throne. Above the platform is an enormous mosaic figure of Christ in majesty seated on his throne, no doubt mirroring the earthly ruler seated below. The second aspect is the ceiling of the nave and its aisles. Whereas the sanctuary and its apses are vaulted in stone and decorated with mosaics, the ceilings of the nave and aisles are made of wood, and the wood is carved in the Islamic form of decoration called makhanas. Don't seem to be able to get my label through, but anyway, never mind. Called makhanas, M-Q-A-R-N-A-S. The ceilings are lavishly decorated with paintings executed in characteristically Islamic style and representing secular subjects such as dancers, girls and kings. The Sicilian royal court was heavily influenced by Muslim culture, so it is not surprising that its craftsmen drew on such Muslim decoration. What is surprising, however, is that they should have applied it to the nave and aisles of what appears to be a church, decorating it with secular scenes. The contrast between these ceilings and the religious mosaics covering the inside of the dome and vaults of the sanctuary, together with the throne platform, led William Tronso to suggest that the nave, as originally built, was not really part of the church at all, but was a throne room, a reception hall, with the sanctuary to the east originally being the totality of the chapel. Here you can see a plan of the chapel. There is the throne platform, there is the sanctuary. The position of the royal seat in the chapel would then have been the royal box, which it has been suggested was located at first floor level in the north wall of what is now the sanctuary. If Tronso's argument is accepted, the Cappella Palatina represented an intimate fusion between secular and religious functions, the merging of a throne room with a chapel. A parallel merging is evident in an even grander palace complex, the Great Palace of the Emperors in Constantinople. Very little of this has ever been excavated or ever will be, but its layout is reasonably well known from the 10th century text called the Book of the Ceremonies. Religious buildings played an important part in that layout. At the palace's gates was the great church of Hagia Sophia, built by the emperors, even though it was the Patriarch's church. And at the heart of the palace was the church of St. Mary of the Lighthouse, which until the 13th century had enshrined in it the true cross, the crown of thorns, and other relics of central importance to the emperors. The fusion between secular and religious is most evident, however, in the reception room adjacent to St. Mary of the Lighthouse. This was the golden triclinium, the chrysotriklinos, the principal throne room and reception room of the palace. What is striking about this space, as Donald Featherstone has reconstructed it from the Book of the Ceremonies, is the extent to which its architecture was parallel to that of a church. As the emperor sat on his golden throne in the apse of the room, under a great mosaic of Christ, the distinction between secular and religious must have seemed very blurred. The golden triclinium was a throne room, but also a temple for Oakley's politics of enchantment. Such architectural forms had a major influence in the West, clearly on the Cappella Palatina, as we have seen, but also on the palace architecture of the Frankish ruler Charlemagne, especially in the palace church which he constructed at Aachen in the late 8th century. This church is, as you all know, still standing, and there were in the early 20th century extensive excavations of buildings around it which have given us the impression that we know well the layout of Charlemagne's palace, which has been so often represented in reconstruction models, so graphically displayed in the exhibition at Aachen last year. In fact, the function of many of the components is unknown. The Great Hall, with its Tower of Granus, its stair turret still standing to its full height, its gallery, the two-storey corridor connecting it to the church area, the now doubly mysterious central building, made doubly mysterious since the recent excavations, and the equally puzzling annex basilicas attached to the church. As my friend Clemens Bayer has emphasised to me, it's not even clear how much of this really is the palace which has been excavated. A solid point, however, is the palace church, and this structure serves to underline the secular religious ambiguity in three ways. First, the position of the ruler's throne in the church. As I'm sure you all know, the octagonal nave has running round it on all sides a first-floor gallery, and the marble throne is positioned, and probably always has been, but we can discuss this later, at the top of the flight of steps in the western gallery. There is the gallery, and there you can see the throne with the nave rising to the full height of the dome or cupola in the centre. This position gave the throne a clear view down. There is the throne as you can see it now looking across the church towards the west. There is the first floor gallery, and there is the throne at the top of that flight of steps in the western part of the gallery. The throne thus had a clear view down to what was originally the high altar, and a view up to what was originally a great wall painting, then soon after a mosaic, of Christ in Majesty. The present mosaic of this subject is a replacement of around 1900, but it appears closely to reflect the Carolingian decor. The throne was no doubt intended to be used by the ruler during religious services, and it was also the throne on which kings of Germany were installed at their coronations right down to the 16th century. But its position underlines how much a church could also be a throne room. Secondly, the atrium. This has largely disappeared under the forecourt of canons' houses called the Domhof, which you can see here leading down to this great niche in the west wall of the church. Nevertheless, archaeological excavations and study of surviving fragments of the original atrium have made a reconstruction possible, and this is Tom McClendon's reconstruction. The side walls of the atrium were punctuated by 4 projecting exedrae, that is, features opening into semicircular niches. These were subsequently, perhaps very soon after their construction, provided with an arcade of arches to separate them from the atrium. The effect must have been very grand. The exedrae reflected the tall semicircular niche on the west wall of the church, which I pointed out to you on the photograph, creating a balanced and monumental courtyard. An atrium was, of course, a normal feature of grand early churches, intended to provide dignified access to the church itself. But the monumentality of this one suggests that its function was more to do with elevating the ruler's position in a theatrical context, and Helmut Boyman suggested long ago that it acted as an outdoor reception space with the emperor enthroned against the imposing western niche. The effect would have been much what is suggested for the peristyle courtyard, which forms the principal entrance to the Palace of Diocletian at Split in Croatia. There, as in the atrium at Aachen, the ruler could have presented himself against the imposing backdrop of the great arch structure at the far end of the courtyard. Thirdly, the status of the Church of Aachen. I was brought up to regard it and to refer to it as the Palace Chapel, and that terminology is still used. But Clemens Bayer in particular, and before him his teacher Ludwig Falkenstein, have shown that the church was not a chapel, but both a parish church, for it had a mixed cemetery from an early date and a baptismal font, and the home of a major community of canons of some importance. Indeed, Clemens has argued that the church was on two levels with its first floor gallery, precisely because the lower level was exclusive to the canons, while the upper level was reserved for the laity. At all events, we are dealing with a church which was a considerable religious foundation, probably from its very beginnings, as Falkenstein showed in his comparison between it and Charles the Bald's foundation at Compiègne, and at the heart of Charlemagne's palace. Here again we can see, I'm suggesting, this merging of secular and religious at the core of a power centre. Finally, Westminster. From its establishment by King Edward the Confessor in the 11th century, this was of course the site of a royal palace. It was a very great royal palace, especially after King William Rufus's construction in stone of the enormous Westminster Hall around 1100 and King Henry III's sponsoring of the famous Painted Chamber in the 13th century. And it was adjacent to a very great royal religious complex, Westminster Abbey, the site of both the coronation and the burial of almost all the English kings from the time of Edward the Confessor onwards. This abbey was umbilically linked to the palace, as Christopher Wilson has shown, and there was also an overlap of function between the palace and the abbey, especially in the chapter house, which Henry III had patronised. Its floor was decorated with tiles bearing the royal arms of England. It was used as a meeting place for Parliament and as a reception hall where the king received ambassadors and other guests and did business of the highest importance. Once again, the merging of secular and religious seems to be apparent. Even if you are in agreement with me so far, and perhaps you aren't, I can feel you thinking, this is all very well for the great kingdoms and empires of Europe, and especially in the high and late Middle Ages, when rulership was achieving great heights of grandeur. But what has it to do with earlier periods and with less high-flown centres of power? What, in short, has it to do with limage? Let me answer that question in two ways. First, by underlining the extent to which, to my mind, the early medieval documentation points, in some areas of Europe at least, to just as close an integration between secular and religious as I've been presenting to you hitherto. Indeed, the integration that we can glimpse in the case of the kingdoms of Northumbria and Kent is in some ways even closer. In my PhD thesis of long ago, published as the Mildreth Legend, I was interested in the function of saints' cults in the early medieval governmental framework of the Kingdom of Kent. The evidence for that framework is inevitably, I suppose, difficult and disputable, and it has recently been reviewed, of course, by Stuart Brooks. It was originally, or at least in the modern period originally, presented by J.E.S. Jolliffe in a book published in 1933. Jolliffe was an utterly infuriating scholar. For all his inaccuracies and eccentricities, though, his argument that if you look at Domesday Book for Kent from the late 11th century, you can reconstruct from it a much earlier system of administrative units called lathes, which were characterised by having assigned to them 80, or in some cases 40, of the basic land units of Kent, which were called sullungs. Seems to me nevertheless convincing. For Jolliffe, an 80 or a 40 sullung lathe was in origin a royal administrative district or a regio focused on a royal vill, which was responsible for the collection of royal feom or food rent. Jolliffe's ideas in this respect were influential on R.H.C. Davis, who identified similar early units of administration in East Anglia, and on Geoffrey Barrow, who identified them in southern Scotland. Jolliffe himself had identified them in Northumbria in his paper Northumbrian Institutions. In the case of the Kingdom of Kent, I noted in my PhD thesis, and others have done so, the relationship between early Kentish royal abbeys and the lathes or early regiones. The Royal Abbey of Minster in Thanet probably sat at the heart of such a regio, inhabited by the Tenet Wara, the people of Thanet, and assessed at Jolliffe's diagnostic figure of 80 sullungs. Limage itself was probably the centre of another regio, which appears in Domesday Book as Limawart Lathe. The GE ending, as Gabor said this morning, to the place name derives from the continental Germanic gau, meaning administrative district, a regio, in other words. The royal monastery of Hu also appears in an early charter as a regio, its inhabitants the Howara. Folkestone, another early royal abbey, was assessed at 40 sullungs in Domesday Book, a figure which fitted with Jolliffe's argument. Eastry, which also had the GE ending to the place name, appears in early hagiographical texts which constitute the Mildred legend as having a royal hall. But there too, secular and religious functions seem closely intertwined, for it was under the royal throne in that hall that the miracle-working bodies of the martyred Kentish princes Ethelbert and Ethelred were buried. Eastry appears as a lathe in Domesday Book and has, of course, been the subject of Tanya Dickinson's excavations. There is at least a strong suggestion here that in the Kingdom of Kent from early times, monasteries and royal centres of government went together. There are also hints that the monasteries may not only have been sited at such centres, but may also have been undertaking government functions on behalf of kings. The earliest hagiographical texts of the Mildred legend, which I argued go back to the 8th century, describe how the Royal Abbey of Minster in Thanet received an initial endowment, admittedly measured out by the miraculous running of a hind, and that is my title slide is the early 15th century map of Thanet by Thomas of Elmham, showing the miraculous course of a hind. It's that line running across Thanet here, which I discussed in an earlier paper, actually does correspond to a boundary with the adjacent area of Monkton. The texts that describe this granting of 80 sullungs do not seem to be derived from the early charters or from Domesday Book, on which Jolliffe based his view that this was the characteristic size of an early regio. My suggestion was that Minster in Thanet had simply been endowed with such a regio, which it was then to govern. Indications that monasteries were themselves functioning as centres of royal government also come from the Kingdom of Northumbria. Just as in Kent the pattern of lathes emerges from the 11th century Domesday Book, so in Northumbria we can perceive in the 12th century Bolden Book survey and in other medieval sources a pattern of regiones called simply shires. It is striking that the early royal monasteries of Coldingham sat at the heart of Coldinghamshire, Hexham at the heart of Hexhamshire, and Lindisfarne at the heart of Islandshire. It is hard, to my mind, to escape the conclusion that such monasteries were acting as centres of royal government in their own right. Early monasteries having such governmental functions need not be a surprise. Wilhelm Levison long ago drew attention to charters from the Royal Abbey of Winchcombe in the Kingdom of Mercia, where, according to his argument, the archives of the former royal house were being preserved. since all the surviving early medieval English charters and most other documents seem not only to have been archived but also written in or on behalf of religious houses, monasteries were clearly in a very good position to administer royal regiones. It is, of course, the case that in the early period they often had members of the royal families as their abbots and abbesses, which would have been entirely consistent with such governmental functions. When I suggested the subject of this presentation as a topic for this workshop, Gabor's response was that it was all about Christian monasteries and would have little interest for those specialising in the pagan world, especially Scandinavia. Well, it's true that I have so far been concentrating exclusively on Christian sites. But just as I'm arguing that there was no secular religious distinction in such sites in the Christian world, indeed that rulership itself crossed any boundary between the two so that its centres of government did likewise, so it seems to me that a comparable approach has been just applicable to the pagan Scandinavian world. Granted, we know rather little about the framework of government, we know perhaps even less about religion, if we disregard the testimony of the 13th century Latin sources. But nonetheless, a site like what was clearly some sort of centre of government on the shores of Lake Tisser seems to represent the same fusion between secular and religious that I've been exploring in the Christian world. You can see here, in its 8th and 9th century phase, the close juxtaposition between a great hall and an enclosed area to the south of it, which Lars Jørgensen interpreted as a possible cult area with some sort of religious building within it. To the north of the hall was a smithy, and as I'm sure you all know, Lotte Hedeager has made what is to my mind a strong case for the religious significance of metalworking in early Scandinavia. Another site which Hedeager also discussed illuminatingly for the purposes of his presentation is Gudme, also in Denmark. There, two enormous halls, as again I'm sure you all know, mark what was presumably a government centre, responsible for collecting renders from perhaps 50 surrounding agrarian centres and in close contact with the nearby port of Lundenburg. But here too, there are in Hedeager's argument clear indications that secular and religious were intimately intertwined. The halls are notable for extensive finds of precious metal objects from within and around them, as well as for metalworking around them. And Hedeager stresses the probable religious dimension of this. Around Gudme are hills bearing names which refer to pagan religious practice, and nearby is a very large cemetery suggestive of the religious significance of the site. Hedeager boldly argues that the whole landscape of Gudme was conceived of as representing Asgard as the home of the gods, in the same way, she argues, as Christian churches were regarded as representing the heavenly Jerusalem. And she could have argued, as Christina Kähler has done, that so too were Christian palaces, not only the Byzantine palaces, Thessaloniki for example, but in 14th century Karlstein in Bohemia, where quite clearly the decor and construction of the sequence of chapels in that palace is intended to represent it as the heavenly Jerusalem. A third site suggestive of such secular religious intertwining in Scandinavia is Lyra, near Roskilde. Dung kings are set in a landscape rich in monuments, including prehistoric monuments. We're looking now out from the site of the earlier set of great halls, looking across the river Lyra towards some at least of these monuments, and the landscape is very rich in them, including prehistoric monuments, on the importance of which Sarah has recently laid emphasis. As I suggested at the beginning of this presentation, there is something more fundamental at stake here, namely the character of rulership itself. It is Francis Oakley's contention that there was a continuum in that character from the earliest times of kingship back indeed to the ancient kingdoms of the Middle East, right through to the effective demise of kingship in the early modern and modern periods. That character, Oakley argues, was essentially religious. When we first see kings, they were religious figures. Their role was the politics of enchantment. However much great bureaucratic structures grew up to support kingly rule in the course of the Middle Ages, or indeed in the Roman and Byzantine emperors, the king or emperor was still dependent, in Oakley's view, for his power on his religious position. That could take many forms. Marriage with a sacred mare, in Gerald of Wales's account of Irish kingship, being crowned on a sacred stone, in the case of the Scottish kings, sitting enthroned under the dome of the cosmos in your palace, in the case of Pedro the Cruel at Seville, living in a palace designed to emphasise your identity with the sun itself, in the case of Louis XIV of France. If early kings in the Scandinavian and Germanic world did not have this religious character, Oakley argues, that would be very remarkable indeed. Of course, I'm well aware that this is a highly controversial matter, formally mired in over-enthusiastic application of 13th century writings by Storri Sturluson and others, insofar as they purported to describe pagan religion and mythology, and not desperately well handled by Cheney in his book The Cult of Kingship in Anglo-Saxon England of some decades ago. But it does seem to me that it is time we thought really hard about this again, and that in some ways the pendulum is swinging. Oakley's case seems supported by recent... It's possible, yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't see a problem really with the dual use of the church. It's something like having a parochial nave, after all, and a communal Eastern. John, you're wasting time.
I think what you were saying makes a very good sense of a lot of Anglo-Saxon phenomena. I mean, I think that maybe the sort of numinous quality of these halls is exactly the direction in which several people here have been moving. And also, I mean, I think the Arkham parallel, it may be, I'm thinking particularly of Northampton and the halls there, and the problem of the function. I mean, that does make, because just two qualifications. Anglo-Saxon, of course, is not homogeneous. East Kent, and I think, remember, we are talking not even about just all of Kent, we're talking about East Kent, is very different from many parts of England, and I completely agree that what essentially our source, the Canterbury Charters and other sources, reveal exactly the sort of structure that you described. If one takes, for example, the Worcester archive, you see nothing of that at all. It's completely different. There is none of that sense of a parallelism of royal centres with monasteries. Incidentally, since we haven't a clue what's happening in Suffolk, I think one simply can't say whether a Rendlesham situation might, and it might very well fit a Kentish situation, perhaps more than the West Midland one. The other thing I wanted to say was, I mean, obviously one shouldn't be seduced by terminology and rhetoric. Nonetheless, there is a lot of rhetoric in Anglo-Saxon England about the independence of monasteries, about their freedom from secular involvement, Council of Clovis-Hoe, that whole rhetoric of confrontation in the course of the 8th century, which seems to cut across the evidence in a rather different direction. I just wonder what
I would only respond by saying that there's quite a lot of evidence for rhetoric about the church being separate from the state in the Gregorian period too, and it doesn't alter the fact that Ottonian and Salian Germany are extensively founded.
Yeah, I think nobody's going to deny there are close interconnections. Saying that royal space and monastic space are essentially the same thing. It's going a step further.
I think I'm not trying to suggest that there aren't monastic communities which are separate. All I was really suggesting was that monastic, or at least, let's say, religious communities are likely to be integral to royal sites. There may be some which are entirely separate and represent a separate strand.
Yes, then there's a question of how often one really gets coexistence.
Absolutely.
Of course, there is a problem.
Yeah.
Actually, just coming on that, I wondered if you wanted to elaborate on the fact. I mean, obviously, we get a greater degree of planning, for example, on some of these sites, particularly towards the sort of 7th and 8th century, and there's we're looking at much more organised, well-aligned complexes. I mean, is that something you see also as being monastic influence or integration of ideas from a monastic context into a secular context?
I suppose if we knew what a monastery looked like prior to the Plan of St. Gall, it would be easier to answer that question. I mean,
raised.
Yeah, no, I know. And I mean, because of the Plan of St. Gall, we assume that that's what a monastery looks like, and that, earlier forms of monasteries must be a pale reflection, at least, of that. But actually, do we know?
Because what's fascinating there is the Opus Signinum at Lyminge. I mean, those Opus Signinum floors in those halls at Lyminge and Dover, I mean, that's clearly a direct importation from that.
Going in that direction. In Northumbria, it's often argued that you see the influence going the other way. Both
from the secular halls through to the kind of high dot
yes.
churches and Roman churches. I mean, I was struck because I think Rosemary Crampett did actually suggest that the last phase at Yevrin could be monastic, didn't she, at the Lyminge conference? Was that
right? She did float that one.
Yeah, so that's quite a good point to end on, maybe. Okay, so thank you very much. We'll come back to